The history of Mexican Americans, Americans of Mexican descent, largely begins after the annexation of parts of Mexico in 1848. The nearly 80,000 individuals then living in the U.S. became full U.S. citizens. Large-scale new migration augmented the numbers during the 1910s, as Mexico was torn by a high-casualty civil war. Until the 1960s, most lived within a few hundred miles of the border, although some resettled along frail lines from the southwest to the Midwest. More recently, Mexican Americans have diffused throughout the U.S., especially in the Midwest and Southeast, with the largest numbers in California and Texas. In the past 100 years, Mexican Americans have campaigned for voting rights, stood against educational, employment, and ethnic discrimination, and stood for economic and social advancement. At the same time, many Mexican Americans have struggled with defining and maintaining the community's identity. In the 1960s and 1970s, some Hispanic student groups flirted with nationalism and differences over the proper name for members of the community of Chicano, Chicana, Latino, Latina, Mexican Americans. Hispanics, or simply La Raza, became tied up with deeper disagreements over whether to integrate into or remain separate from Anglo society, as well as divisions between those Mexican Americans whose families had lived in the United States for 2 or more generations and more recent immigrants. Before the founding of the United States, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, California, Colorado, and Wyoming were part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain and later formed part of the newly independent Mexican Republic. The Spaniards first entered the region in the late 16th century, starting small settlements in what is now New Mexico. In California, Spanish friars formed a string of missions designed to convert the Indians to Christianity, along with the system of forts and land grants to favored associates of the king. The missions enabled small-scale Spanish settlement of the coastal California by a few hundred Spanish immigrants. Very small Spanish-speaking settlements were established near missions and forts in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado and Texas by the mid-18th century. 19th century, when Mexico took over control from Spain in the early 1820s, the new government ignored and isolated the Norteños, except to break up the mission system in California. The systematic Navajo and Apache raids on New Mexico villages and ranches were ignored, as was the vulnerability of California, as the central government pulled back its soldiers to use them in recurrent civil wars and factional battles. When Texas seemed too independent, Mexico's President Santa Anna led an army to massacre the villages and destroy the American settlements. After initial victories and massacres at the Alamo and Goliad, Santa Anna was decisively defeated by the Texans, who declared independence. The Tejanos in Texas joined the revolution and supported the new Republic of Texas. The Hispanics in New Mexico and California were localistic and did not identify with the regime in Mexico City. The Norteños played a minor role in the Mexican-American War of 1846–48, and when offered the choice of repatriating to Mexico or remaining and becoming full citizens of the United States, the great majority remained. Only when large numbers of Americans arrived did they develop a sense of lo Mexicano, that is, of being Mexican, and that new identification had little to do with far-off Mexico. American entrepreneurs often cultivated alliances and partnerships with the Mexican propertied elites in the states of Texas and California, and the territories of New Mexico and Arizona. The Californios, who only numbered 10,000 in 1848, remained in California but were soon overwhelmed by the immigration of hundreds of thousands of newcomers to California, and largely became invisible to Anglos. The Latino culture of the rest of the Southwest, especially New Mexico and southern Texas, called itself Spanish to distinguish themselves from Los Norteamericanos. The Latinos emphasized their own religion, language, customs and kinship ties, and drew into enclaves, rural colonies and urban barrios, which Norteamericanos seldom entered. Intermarriage rates were low. Beginning in the 1820s, immigrants from the U.S. and Europe settled in Texas, then part of Mexico. Anglo and Hispanic Texas joined to fight Mexico in 1836, defeating an invading army and declaring the independence of Texas. The Texas Republic included Tejanos as leading citizens, but Mexico refused to recognize its legal existence. The U.S. annexed Texas in 1845, leading to the Mexican-American War of 1846–48. While there were some Americans who considered the war with Mexico illegal and immoral, others considered it part of manifest destiny, the American destiny to pursue the war. This policy claimed that it was the United States' right to expand westward across North America and settle the land. The Americans won easily and the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In the treaty, Mexico gave up more than 500,000 square miles of territory, which today comprises Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The United States in 1853 purchased the Gadsden Purchase, a strip of land in southern New Mexico and Arizona that provided a route for a railroad. The result was unchallenged American control over a wide range of territory once held by Mexico, including the present-day states of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and California. The vast majority of Hispanic populations chose to stay and become full U.S. citizens. By and large, the Hispanic populations of these areas supported the new government. The Mexican government had become despotic under on and off again President General Santa Anna, and the U.S. government offered protection from Indian raids that Mexico had not prevented, meaning an end to civil wars of the sort that continuously racked Mexico until 1920, and it promised much greater long-run prosperity. Although the treaty promised that the landowners in this newly acquired territory would enjoy full enjoyment and protection of the property as if they were citizens of the United States, many former citizens of Mexico lost their claims in lawsuits before state and federal courts. Even those statutes intended to protect the owners of property at the time of the extension of the United States' borders, such as the 1851 California Land Act, had the effect of dispossessing California owners ruined by the cost of maintaining litigation over land titles for years. After the Santa Fe Ring succeeded in dispossessing thousands of landholders in New Mexico, groups such as Las Gorras Blancas tore down fences or burned down interlopers' farm buildings. In western Texas, the political struggle sparked an armed conflict in which the Tejano majority forced the surrender of the Texas Rangers, but in the end lost their influence, offices, and economic opportunities. In other areas, particularly California, the Hispanic residents were simply overwhelmed by the number of Anglo settlers who rushed in. First in Northern California as a result of the California Gold Rush, then decades later by the boom in Southern California. Anglo miners drove Hispanic miners out of the camps, barred non-Anglos from testifying in court, and imposed exclusionary standards similar to what was called Jim Crow in the case of African Americans. Some Hispanics, of whom Joaquin Murrieta was a legendary example and Tiburcio Vasquez Ariel one, responded by resorting to banditry. During the gold rush, there was an immigration of Mexican miners to California. About 20,000 Tejanos lived in South Texas in the 1850s. The social structure has been analyzed by historian Randolph Campbell. South Texans of Hispanic descent lived in a three-tiered society during the antebellum years. At the top stood the landed elite, the owners of huge ranches, many of which originated as haciendas in the Spanish colonial period. The elite based their economic lives on cattle raising. They sold some cattle in Mexico and Louisiana and exported hides and tallow, but access to major urban markets outside the region was so limited that South Texas ranchers did not develop highly commercial operations during the antebellum years. This apparently suited most very well anyhow, in that they viewed the ranches primarily as a way of life rather than a business investment, and therefore focused on keeping the property intact as well as turning a profit. Small landowners occupied the second rung of the South Texas economic and social ladder. These rancheros, as they were called, lived in one-room adobe houses and spent most of their time caring for the small herds of horses and cattle. Although a smaller part of the population, they can be compared, it seems, to the plain folk Anglos of East Texas. That is, they differed from the elite only in the extent of the property, not in the dependence on the land of the way they tried to live. Finally, South Texas had a lower class composed primarily of peons, vaqueros, and carmen. Peons had a status above that of the slaves in antebellum Texas but below that of genuinely free men. They owned no property, could not travel or call in a doctor without the permission of the estate owner, and needed his approval for marriages. When a peon was accused of an offense, the patron acted as judge and jury. On the other hand, peons were not property and therefore could not be bought and sold or treated as personal chattels in any way. Somewhere in an ill-defined place between that of slaves and free men, they served as faithful servants to the upper class. Peons worked at the direction of the patrons, planting and harvesting crops, herding goats, digging wells, and doing any sort of manual labor necessary. In return, they received wages or credits at the estate's store in amounts so small that they were constantly in debt. They lived in tiny one-room jacals, huts with walls of mud or any other material available and thatched roofs. The one room served for both living and sleeping. Cooking and eating took place in a separate enclosure made of grassy corn stalks. The poor, landless class also included vaqueros, the men who herded and took care of cattle. Ranch owners and mission priests generally considered it beneath their dignity to do such work and thought of these first Texas cowboys simply as laborers riding horses. No one involved could have imagined that millions of Americans would one day see working cattle as an ultimately romantic and heroic part of Texas's past. At least vaqueros, as befitted the future image, had more independence than peons. They were not bound to the land and could even expect to acquire property of their own someday. Cartmen lived in San Antonio or along the route from that city to Indianola and earned their living by transporting food and merchandise from the coast to the interior. Using ox carts, they virtually monopolized this particular freight route by moving goods quickly and cheaply. Anglo competitors appeared by the 1850s but were unable to match the rates charged by the Tejanos. Carting appears to have been the most lucrative business open to poorer Tejanos during these years. In parts of South Texas and southern Arizona, Hispanic Americans were able to obtain positions within in local government, while in New Mexico Hispanic Americans remained an absolute majority of the population until the end of the 19th century. The federal government delayed granting statehood to New Mexico because of its Hispanic American political leadership. Despite integration, Hispanic Americans managed to retain the Spanish language and culture. They were most successful in those areas where they had retained some measure of political or economic power, where Jim Crow laws imposed a forced isolation, or where immigrants from Mexico made up a significant percentage of the community. Anti-Mexican American violence. The lynching of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the Southwest has long been overlooked in American history. This may be due to the fact that most historical records categorized Mexicans, Italians, Native Americans, and sometimes Chinese lynching victims as white. It is estimated that at least 597 Mexican Americans were lynched between 1848 and 1928. Mexicans were lynched at a rate of 27.4 per 100,000 of population between 1880 and 1930. This statistic is second only to that of the African American community during that period, which suffered an average of 37.1 per 100,000 population. Between 1848 to 1879, Mexicans were lynched at an unprecedented rate of 473 per 100,000 of population. Most of these lynchings were not instances of frontier justice. Of the 597 total victims, only 64 were lynched in areas which lacked a formal judicial system. The majority of lynching victims were denied access to a trial, while others were convicted in unfair trials. During the California Gold Rush, as many as 25,000 Mexicans arrived in California. Many of these Mexicans were experienced miners and had some success mining gold in California. Some anglers reacted with violence. Between 1848 and 1860, at least 163 Mexicans were lynched in California alone. Immigration and diffusion. Hispanic Americans made up a significant number of workers in a number of industries, particularly the railroad and mining industries in the southwestern U.S. that led to the growth of communities throughout the region. The employment needs of the railroad industry in the late 19th century brought Mexican immigrants from more remote regions of Mexico, while the new systems integrated the border regions of the United States and Mexico. The railroad also led to the economic development of those parts of the U.S., drawing Mexican immigrants in large numbers into agriculture in the early 20th century, establishing a pattern that continued thereafter. These largely male Mexican immigrants also established colonias in the early 20th century in places such as Chicago, Kansas City, and Salt Lake City, Utah, as railroad employment took them further within the United States. Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants also moved in large numbers to Denver, the San Francisco Bay Area, and to a lesser extent to Detroit, Minneapolis, and the Monongahela Valley, Pennsylvania, during World War I to work in the steel and automobile manufacturing industry. Others began migrating from South Texas to work in cotton fields elsewhere in Texas and Oklahoma, and from Southern California went to work in summer harvests of groves and orchards in Oregon and the Yakima Valley, Washington. More recently, beginning in significant numbers in the 1970s, Mexican immigrants have moved in large numbers to the Midwest U.S., attracted by jobs in the packing house industry, and to the southeastern U.S., where they have displaced many African Americans and contract workers from the Caribbean in agriculture and related industries. This large wave of Mexican immigration are attracted to low-paid labor jobs, and an equally high number move to low-income low-income communities, such as industrial suburbs of Los Angeles in ethnic neighborhoods known as barrios and the agricultural sector of Imperial Valley, California. Early 20th century Texas. In Texas, people of Hispanic ethnicity, most of whom were Mexican nationals, began arriving in greater numbers between 1900 and 1930. Adding to the number of older Hispanic residents already in Texas, some of whom had been here since the Spanish colonial era. Many of these new immigrants engaged in cotton production by performing the back-breaking work of hoeing cotton fields clean of weeds and harvesting the mature crop during the summer and fall. These resilient people established themselves in communities where earlier Hispanics already existed, from settlements in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, communities in the Nueces Strip between Three Rivers and Corpus Christi, Texas, and the interior city of San Antonio. Hispanics ventured outward following the maturing cotton crop north and west. They traveled by extended family groups on an odyssey known as the Big Swing. Along the route, some younger family members might land a permanent job and stay behind. From Lubbock to San Angelo, Hispanics now form an integral part of the local communities. Hispanics living in New Mexico were relegated to second-class social status by the socio-economically dominant non-Hispanic population. Some of these Anglos deprecated Hispanic Mexican culture and questioned the native population's fitness for democracy. Some claim, in response, they constructed a Spanish-American identity in an early instance of cultural citizenship, but this is strongly disputed by Richard Nostrand. World War I gave the Hispanics the opportunity to prove the full American citizenship. Like the new immigrants in eastern cities who also constructed dual identities, members of the Nuevo Mexicano middle class exuberantly participated in the war effort. They melded images of their heritage with patriotic symbols of America, especially in the Spanish-language press. Nuevo Mexicano politicians and community leaders recruited the rural masses into the war cause overseas and on the home front, including the struggle for women's suffrage. Support from New Mexico's Anglo establishment aided their efforts. The wartime contributions improved the conditions of minority citizenship for Nuevo Mexicanos but did not entirely eliminate social inequality. For example, no Hispanics, not even the son of a regent, was allowed in a fraternity at the state university. The Anglos and Hispanics cooperated because both prosperous and poor Hispanics could vote, and they outnumbered the Anglos. Around 1920, the term Spanish-American replaced Mexican in polite society and in political debate. The new term served both the interests of both groups. For Spanish speakers, it evoked Spain, not Mexico, recalling images of a romantic colonial past and suggesting a future of equality in Anglo-dominated America. For Anglos, on the other hand, it was a useful term that upgraded the state's image. For the old image as a Mexican land suggested violence and disorder, and had discouraged capital investment and set back the statehood campaign. The new term gave the impression that Spanish Americans belonged to a true American political culture, making the established order appear all the more democratic. 1910 to 1930s. After 1911, the ferocious civil wars in Mexico led 600,000 to 1 million refugees to flee north across the border, which was generally open. Well-educated middle-class families emigrated, as well as poor citizens. In Texas, a band of radicals issued the Manifesto Plan de San Diego in 1915 in South Texas, calling on Hispanics to reconquer the Southwest and kill all the Anglo men. Rebels assassinated opponents and killed several dozen people in attacks on railroads and ranches before the Texas Rangers smashed the insurrection. Tejanos strongly repudiated the Plan began and affirmed their American loyalty by founding the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, headed by professionals, businessmen and modernizers, became the Central Tejano organization promoting civic pride and civil rights. Over 500,000 returned after 1930, but many stayed. The consulates of the Mexican government in major cities in the Southwest organized a network of juntas patrioticas and comisiones honorificos to celebrate Mexican national holidays such as the Cinco de Mayo. The target audience was the Latino middle class. In borderlands towns such as Brownsville, Corpus Christi, Laredo, San Antonio, El Paso, Tucson, Yuma, San Diego, and Los Angeles, local Latino leaders wanted to restrict the influx of immigrants, because the newcomers directly competed with resident Latinos for jobs and housing, and because they reinforced negative stereotypes regarding a lazy and violent lifestyle. In 1929, the League of United Latin American Citizens was formed on the premise that full acceptance of American social, educational and political values was the only way Latinos could reasonably expect to improve the political, economic, and social position in American society. Some upwardly mobile families joined Protestant churches, but most remained devout, conservative Roman Catholics. From the early 1930s through the 1960s, LULAC's political agenda focused on citizenship training and naturalization of foreign-born Mexicans, English language training, active support of anti-discriminatory litigation and legislation, and strict control of further immigration from Mexico. LULAC promoted the liberal rhetoric of equality and rights and the mutual obligations of Republican civic duty. However, voting levels were quite low, and especially in South Texas the Latino vote was controlled by local bosses. There was little in the way of radical movements. Mexican immigration. Most Mexican Americans are descendants of immigrants who moved into the U.S. in high numbers after 1910. Many first arrived as agricultural laborers in farming valleys of the southern ends of the border states of California, especially the Imperial Valley, Arizona, especially Tucson, New Mexico, and Texas, especially the Rio Grande Valley. Anglo-Americans hired Mexicans and U.S.-born Mexicans to work in the region's year-round agricultural economy, most notably in tomatoes, carrots, lettuce, grapes, strawberries and citrus fruit. Mexican farm laborers along with African Americans, Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans, and even Armenian Americans, Native Hawaiians and American Indians were highly instrumental and contributed to California becoming the nation's leading agricultural state in the 20th century. Large-scale emigration from central Mexico to the United States began in the 1920s. Mexico was exempted from the system of quotas created by the Immigration Act of 1924, with U.S. politicians hoping to dissuade the revolutionary government from carrying out the nationalization the nation's oil reserves decreed in the 1917 Constitution of Mexico. In 1926, the anti-clerical policies of Plutarco Elias Calles led to a rebellion by Catholic ranchers and peasants in Jalisco and Michoacán, known as the Cristero War. The rebellion spread to 13 states across the center of Mexico, with upwards of 50,000 people taking up arms to defend the Catholic Church. Although they failed to capture any major cities, the Federal Army was unable to defeat these mounted guerrillas. Between 1926 and 1930, the Cristero War claimed 70,000 lives, led to the internal migration of 200,000 people, as well as the external emigration of over 450,000 people. The establishment of a major Mexican presence in California dates back to these years. Mexicans met the increasing demand for cheap labor on the West Coast after draconian restrictions were imposed on Asian immigration. During this period, Mexicans began to migrate to areas outside the Southwest. They were imported to work in the steel mills of Chicago during a strike in 1919, and again in 1923. Many would find work on the assembly lines of automobile factories in Detroit, and in the meat-packing plants of Chicago and Kansas City. 1930s. During the Great Depression in the United States, the federals adopted a policy of repatriation. Some 400,000 Mexican immigrants and their children were given one-way tickets home. Texas used ranges to forcibly evict Mexicans who refused to accept voluntary repatriation, while Illinois, Indiana and Michigan paid for special trains to take Mexicans home. President Franklin D. Roosevelt promoted a good neighbor policy that sought better relations with Mexico. In 1935, a federal judge ruled that 3 Mexican immigrants were ineligible for citizenship because they were not white, as required by federal law. Mexico protested, and Roosevelt decided to circumvent the decision and make sure the federal government treated Hispanics as white. The State Department, the Census Bureau, the Labor Department, and other government agencies therefore made sure to uniformly classify people of Mexican descent as white. This policy encouraged the League of United Latin American Citizens in its quest to minimize discrimination by asserting whiteness. LULAC, with its middle-class base aspiring to the American dream, emphasized its loyalty to the United States, its commitment to individual achievement, and free market capitalism.